So it's my distinct pleasure to introduce both a colleague and a dear friend. Nick and I go back a pretty long way, even to the point where we shared an office when Nick was a PhD student and I was a postdoc at Oregon State University. This was back in the early 80s. So we've been friends for a long, long time. The reason that Nick is in town is that the Society for Freshwater Science is having their annual meeting here in Sacramento. This is the 64th meeting of this organization, and it is the first time ever that they've had this meeting in California. And in addition, they also have record attendance. I think they have 980 registrants and a record number of presentations. So it was a good choice for them, and it's been a nice venue. And I think most of the people I've been talking to are really enjoying the fact that the meeting is here in California. Hopefully it won't be 64 years before they come back. So let me just tell you a little bit about Nick. I needed to make sure I got the bio timeline correct. But Nick finished his PhD at Oregon State University in 1984, and actually he was part of the STREAM team, with which I was a member also, and it was a very, it was, and I should say is, a very dynamic group of people who are interested in stream and river ecology and work at places like the H.J. Andrews Experimental Forest and a lot of the old growth forests and a lot of the managed forests throughout western Oregon. When Nick finished his PhD, his first job was at the University of Mississippi. He went there and went through the ranks of becoming a tenured faculty member, and once he got tenure, I guess he figured the challenge was over, and so he decided, oh, I've got to do something else, and so he left, and he actually went to the South Florida Water Management District, and where, during his career at the South Florida Water Management District, he ultimately ended up as the director of research for Everglades, Okeechobee, and the Kissimmee River restoration. So those of you who have heard me talk about my period of time on the Technical Advisory Committee for the Kissimmee River Restoration Program, Nick is the reason why that happened. He's the one who really facilitated and basically made that an opportunity, which to me ended up being a very valuable opportunity, one I very much appreciate. After his stint with the South Florida Water Management District, he found out about hardball politics in a very real way. He was fired by the board of the South Florida Water Management District, ended up moving on, I think very shortly thereafter, then to the National Park Service, where he served as I guess the lead scientist for the Everglades program. And then about 3 years ago, I guess, he has moved on to the U.S. Geological Survey, where you can see he's the regional science advisor for South Florida for the U.S. Geological Survey. And with that, Nick, great to have you here and looking forward to what you have to say.
Thank you very much for coming. And also, I'm sure most of you know this, that Cliff was honored with a very nice honor at our society meeting. He received our Society's Award of Excellence, which is the highest award the Society gives. And which really, it's a very sort of highly regarded group of folks, and he's a member of them now. It's kind of like the Society Hall of Fame. It just, maybe it shows our age more. But Cliff's scientific achievements were really well noted in the Society, gave an address on our opening night. So this is very informal as far as I'm concerned. Also, welcome to the folks that are online. This is very informal. If you want to ask questions during the way, please do. I'm going to pretty much divide this into 3 sections. First, I'm just going to give you a little basic primer on Everglades restoration before I actually launch into the second part, which is describing our U.S.G.S. science program in the Everglades. And then the last thing I thought I'd throw in, which I don't really have any slides for, but I can refer you to some websites, is actually how we govern restoration in South Florida. And that's evolved over the years, as you might imagine. And also to speak a little bit about the role of science and how science governance meshes in with governance from the policy standpoint for restoration. I understand there might be some interest in that, just comparing notes. And again, it's still an evolving process even after all these years, but it's something that I think we might spend some time on. So my apologies if you already know a little bit about Everglades restoration, and some of this is background to you. I think I'll use pointer there. So you can see that. Well, the place that we'll focus on is the watershed of the Everglades, which is about 18,000 square miles. And interestingly, that's the same boundaries as the South Florida Water Management District that Cliff mentioned. Like California, and only a few other places, some of our political boundaries coincide with natural boundaries, which I think is really important for good resource management. Florida has 5 water management districts loosely organized around those boundaries, and I think that's led to a lot of differences and improvements in the way we try to manage resources, even despite changes in politics and from time to time. But when we say the Greater Everglades, which is a term we use, we're literally talking from the upper portion of that white area here, which is near Orlando, sort of the headwaters are near Disney, all the way down through Lake Okeechobee, Everglades National Park, out into Florida Bay, and including the reef track. So we have a fairly expansive definition of the Greater Everglades, and it is very much connected. I'd like to show this just as sort of another way of introducing the changes that we as humans have wrought upon the ecosystem, and then talk about the challenges that has presented to us in terms of restoring an ecosystem. On the left, obviously, that's not a satellite image, but it's made to look like a satellite image. That was a map that was constructed to illustrate before human development in Florida what the Everglades looks like, and that's excluding the upper ends of the watershed, but we're just focusing from Lake Okeechobee and then south. And this was a very wet, as you might imagine, water-based ecosystem going from Lake Okeechobee all the way down to Florida Bay, very flat. The drop in elevation from the bottom part there of Lake Okeechobee down to Florida Bay is about 20 feet over several hundred miles. And we have a sort of fun little place in Everglades National Park. If you've ever, how many of you have been in Everglades National Park? You need to get there if you haven't. Put that on your bucket list. It really is some spectacular areas, and you're probably not going to be able to see some of them for too long in terms of decades, in terms of sea level rise. But there's a place where you move from one watershed to another in the park along the main park road. It's called Rock Reef Pass. It's where you split the Taylor Creek watershed from the Shark River watershed. Elevation, the sign, it's really kind of fun. It says 1 meter elevation, the pass. And it literally is changes in inches can define tens and hundreds of square miles of watershed area in definition. So it's a very flat landscape. It was characterized by a very broad, southward moving flow of water through the wetlands that Marjorie Stoneman Douglas termed the River of Grass back in her 1947 book. If you haven't read that, it's a very interesting read. This came out of Lake Okeechobee during the wet season. We have 2 seasons, wet and dry in South Florida, although that's changing as well. As the lake would rise in the summer wet season, it would overflow its southern bank through a pond apple forest that you see depicted there on the southern part of the shore, down through a vast sawgrass plain, then through what we call a ridge and slough landscape, a patterned peat-based landscape with definite ridges and sloughs, but defined again only by very small differences in elevation topographically, interspersed with these beautiful tree islands that serve as really important habitat for a lot of plants and animals. And then the major exit from that watershed would be out through, right here out through Shark River Slough into the Gulf of Mexico, with some minor flows through what was called the Atlantic Coastal Ridge out into Biscayne Bay and out into the Atlantic Ocean. And what's the coastal ridge here, again, use these terms loosely, ridge in South Florida means 4 or 5 meters, but that's where most of the first development occurred. And Florida's a fairly young state in terms of development. The earnest efforts to begin to drain it, to make it more inhabitable, began generally around the 1890s. When Hamilton Distant, an industrialist from Philadelphia, cut the first connection between Lake Okeechobee and the Caloosahatchee River to help drain some of the waters off. So if you contrast the image on the left to the one on the right, where all that sawgrass plain once now is 700,000 acres of mostly sugarcane. It's called the Everglades Agricultural Area. There are quite a bit of winter vegetable crops grown there. We always compare ourselves to California in terms of who's most important for the winter vegetable supply for the country. I don't know who wins, but we just have a lot of it going on. So the unfortunate part of all this is in the headwaters now of the Everglades. And then what was left of this Everglades ridge and slough landscape has been compartmentalized into 3 water conservation areas. Water Conservation Area 1, which is now the Loxahatchee National Wildlife Refuge as well. Water Conservation Area 2, and a much larger Water Conservation Area 3, and then Everglades National Park. But one of the key characteristics of this change we made in the system is how it's now a vastly plumbed system, an artificial system, thousands of miles of canals and levees interspersed with hundreds of water control structures and pumps. I don't know if that might sound familiar to you in this landscape, but thought it might. One of the striking differences always here when I come here is to think about that the main difference in this managed system is we're moving very, very large volumes of water up very tiny heads. Most of our pump stations are designed to raise water 6 or 7 feet, but huge volumes of water. Here, I know in some cases you have very high heads and smaller volumes because of that head. But other than that, the concept is very similar. What we've done is we've put in this drainage system to make this land, especially south of Lake Okeechobee, more inhabitable for both agricultural and urban development. This coastal ridge now is home to, the numbers vary depending on what you're talking about, but 7 to 9 million people in a state that's 20 million people roughly. And the main thing that's happened is the levee that's now around Lake Okeechobee, these major canal systems, you're not seeing any of the minor ones, that intercept that southward flow of water now and distribute it out to the Atlantic Ocean. And these artificial connections that were made on the west and east sides of Lake Okeechobee during high lake stages now discharge vast amounts of fresh water, mostly polluted, out to the east and west coast estuaries and cause a huge amount of environmental damage. And I'll just say basically that our central restoration premises is to get the water right again. And to get the water right means to restore, to the extent possible, that flow of water from Lake Okeechobee down through its historic flow path into Everglades National Park, which you see down here in the green. Everglades National Park is starved for fresh water. Florida Bay receives a fraction of what it received historically before human development. And we know we're never going to get back to that kind of system in its full extent, but the goal is to do the best we can. We've lost more than 50% of the Everglades spatial extent permanently. It's irretrievable. It's now development. It's that agricultural land. It's urban development. Now we have urban development stretching all the way out to the edge of these conservation areas, which is really quite a problem. So, you know, that's unfortunate, but that's the way it is. That's just the way it is, I guess. Let me see if I go back up. If I can go page up. There we go. Go one more. Back to here. So when I refer to the managed system, this is what we're talking about. This managed system came about relatively abruptly. There were, you know, one of the biggest natural events that shaped what the Everglades look like now was a major hurricane in 1928 that came from sort of the West Palm Beach, Fort Lauderdale area, traveled up to the northwest, and because of the counterclockwise direction of the wind, developed a massive seiche on Lake Okeechobee that surged down to the southwest and flooded over a small levee that had been built back in the 20s and drowned close to 3,000 people, mostly migrant farm workers on the south shore of Lake Okeechobee. We'll never know exactly how many because most of those folks are not documented in terms of knowing who they were or where they were. They're just our mass graves there. West Palm Beach has a mass grave of about 800 of them. It was a terrible natural disaster. It's still the third most costliest disaster in the U.S. history from natural means. See the test here. Does anybody know what the greatest loss of life from a natural event in the U.S. was? Galveston, the 1900, the hurricane 1900. What's the number 2? It says you didn't know you're going to get tested as part of this. Anybody? Happened, I think, in the late 40s, 50s? Jonestown floods, the dam breach in Jonestown floods in Pennsylvania, I believe, and then the third one was this. Anyway, so big disaster. And then in 1947, an event, I used to be able to say, can you imagine this? We had back-to-back hurricanes in 1947, 3 weeks apart. Of course, we did again in 2004. But in 2007, back-to-back hurricanes didn't cause a loss of life, but it flooded that entire system you see there in yellow for 3 to 4 months, from Kissimmee, which is a town all the way up at the headwaters, all the way down through Fort Lauderdale, standing water in some places for over 3 months. The residents of Florida said, you know, we've had enough. Federal government, you need to come in and fix this problem. So in 1948, they authorized the Central and Southern Florida Flood Control District, and then over the next 30 years put in this massive civil works project with 2 purposes, that's flood control and water supply. During the wet season, to make sure we drain the water off so people's property is not underwater, and during dry season to make sure we have enough water available for irrigation and drinking water. A little side note is back in when the system was engineered on paper in the early 1950s, the engineers had to think, as engineers do, they built in a margin of safety. They said, by the year 2000, how many people will this system have to accommodate? And so they surveyed people, they talked to folks, they made predictions, and they said, then they multiplied it by 3, and their best guess in the 50s was that by 2000 we'd have 2 million people in the system max. And of course, they were off by a factor of 3 or 4, and it's remarkable the system still works for its design purpose, even though it's triple of its capacity in terms of development. But of course, it did a lot of environmental damage, and that's where we're spending a lot of our restoration work now. I always put into these 5 categories what we're dealing with, really the 5 major challenges we have that are ongoing, and again, some of these are going to sound a little familiar to you. The main one, as I mentioned before, is altered hydropattern, this really big water-based system. We've intercepted that flow of water, taken that and moved it to the east and west coast, not letting it go through the Everglades, which has had incredibly deleterious consequences at any number of levels. We're degrading water quality, mostly from agricultural impacts, but also from urban inputs. And you remember I showed you the Everglades agricultural area, which is at the northern, it's our headwaters now, which is, you know, really unfortunate in terms of looking backwards now that if we had done things differently, we probably would have. But we have an Everglades ecosystem that's extremely sensitive to very tiny changes in phosphorus in particular. It's a phosphorus-limited ecosystem, that an increase of 10 micrograms per liter of total phosphorus can cause just almost irreversible changes over several decades in terms of habitat. And of course, there are a lot of other water quality issues with mercury and other contaminants and pesticides that we have to deal with. A third one, which is consuming an inordinate amount of our time and science dollars and management dollars, is non-native plants and animals. The first part of the history of Everglades restoration, I think, was focused more on the plant side, and now we're switching and not having to give up on the plants, but now moving more and more to our non-native animals. I'll come back a little bit more on that in a minute. Development pressure every day in the state, not counting the little interlude of the financial downturn. 1,000 new people are in the state, a net increase every day of 1,000 people in Florida, most of those in South Florida, not the other parts of the state. So Florida has no income tax. It's still a retirement haven, always will be, I suspect. And then finally the last one, which is the most vexing one in some respects, is climate change. And not just sea level rise. Florida is obviously very vulnerable to sea level rise because of its long coastline, low level area. Everglades National Park, 60% of the freshwater part of the park is at 3 feet or less above sea level. So there's going to be massive changes just in Everglades National Park from sea level rise, but also more recently we're focusing on changes in rainfall patterns. And we are very closely linked to the El Nino climate pattern changes. And Cliff was actually the first one that pointed this out to me in the 80s. Back when I was knew I was going to end up in Florida in the late 80s, he said, you know, you have an interesting situation down there where the signal of what happens in the Pacific Ocean really manifests itself in our weather. And now with climate change, it's going to be even more. We just recently did a modeling exercise and a series of papers in environmental management that a 1.5 degree rise in temperature coupled with a 10% decrease in rainfall over the long term, a scenario that we just picked in the middle, thinking, well, 10%, that might even not be enough to elicit a change in our ecological models and our hydrological models. Boy, were we wrong. Lake Okeechobee has never been below 10 feet in elevation. One time in its recorded history, just barely below 10 feet. Under that scenario of 10% decrease in rainfall, there'll be multiple years where it's below 5 feet, which will be nothing short of catastrophic, both for the environment and not to mention a civil society. And now with some of our more recent downscaling work, we're worrying about greater decreases in rainfall, perhaps up to 50% long-term decreases in rainfall. That's a high uncertainty with those kind of estimates, and we're spending a lot of time and money to try to figure that out better. So the premise of our restoration really is to go from what used to be this image on the left of this sheet flow of water depicted by the blue swath there through the south of Lake Okeechobee to where we are right now with this highly managed system with back to a system where we can, instead of killing the estuaries on the east and west coast with fresh water, can we reroute some of that back down through the Everglades? And that's really what we're spending, estimated now $20 billion over the next 20 to 30 years. And of course, you might have heard that we're not exactly moving along at a blistering pace on some of these projects, which we can talk a little bit about more later. Finally, before I talk more about the GS part of this, U.S.G.S. part, I just got to see this video that probably just will do, in 3 minutes, much better job than I've done giving you background. This was done by high school students in a local high school. So I don't know if you guys get engaged much with kids, but this is, see if we can make this work.
Hi, my name is Eileen Garcia, and I'm 16 years old. In Florida. I want to welcome you to evergladesrestoration.gov. I and students like me helped the government design this website because we wanted to help make it easy for people to learn about Everglades restoration. There is only one Everglades, and it's in trouble. Once a vast connected ecosystem of lakes, rivers, and marshes that stretched from Kissimmee to the Florida Keys, the Everglades is one of the largest wetland systems on the planet. It teems with wildlife, some of which live here year-round, and some that use the Everglades to escape cold winters up north. Clean, fresh water flowing out of the Everglades supported the ecology of the bays and estuaries of South Florida, many of which are famous fisheries today, places like Biscayne Bay, Florida Bay, Mercury Bay, and the 10,000 Islands. Native Americans lived in the Everglades for thousands of years, thriving in a region where food and water were plentiful and the climate was mild. Late in the 1800s, though, our ancestors started to change the Everglades by building levees and canals to drain water off the land so that farms and cities could grow. The process of drainage lasted more than 70 years, and South Florida did become a wonderful place for people from all over to live and work, and it became one of the biggest tourist destinations in the world. But the Everglades paid a heavy price. Today, the Everglades is half the size it used to be. 90% of its wading birds are gone, and it is now home to 71 threatened and endangered species. Those bays and estuaries I mentioned, they've suffered too. But it isn't just nature that has been hurt. People, particularly future generations, my generation, needs the Everglades to survive if we hope to have a good quality of life here in South Florida when we grow up. After all, our drinking water comes from the Everglades. Our fishing and tourism industries rely on the Everglades. We water our lawns and our crops and fill our swimming pools with water from the Everglades. Thankfully, people have been worried about the Everglades for a long time, and in the 1980s, long before I was born, many of them got together and decided something had to be done to save it. Everglades restoration got rolling in the 80s and is full swing today. The goal is to rethink all that drainage and make changes to the levees, canals, and pumps we built decades ago so that water once again flows through the Everglades naturally. Clean water moving through the system at the right time and in the right quantity is the most important ingredient in a healthy Everglades. If Everglades restoration can get the water right, scientists are confident that the ecosystem will grow stronger and healthier and will be better able to survive the natural challenges it faces like fires and hurricanes. Everglades restoration is pretty straightforward. It's not rocket science. In some ways, though, it can seem harder than rocket science. It's not easy to make changes to a water management system as big as South Florida's. Fortunately, a lot of really smart, very committed people are working on it, and they are not just scientists and engineers. They are fishermen, environmentalists, farmers, elected officials, homeowners, bird watchers, divers, and kids. Kids like me who want to help save the Everglades because the future of South Florida really does depend on it. We hope you like this website, and we hope you come back often because we know that the more people learn about the Everglades, the more they will want to help save it.
I think that's pretty amazing. The high school kids that usually do a better job of this than we do. All right, let's see if we can get back on track here. Well, not that. Cancel. Oh, that tab right there. And down, this should bring it back up, right? Okay, sorry about this. All right, so to address some of these issues, the U.S.G.S. focuses a lot of money on science in the Everglades, and that's my major job is to funnel that money that comes through about $6 million a year into priority projects looking at and supporting management and restoration of the Everglades, especially in those areas that we've covered already. I think one of 5 PES programs in the country, that's Priority Ecosystem Sciences, and again, that number kind of changes depending on what you count, but it's places like the Great Lakes, Chesapeake Bay, Puget Sound, the Everglades, et cetera. So it's where, just special places. We used to call this the place-based system. And we bring in U.S.G.S. folks from literally around the country to work in the Everglades. Most of these projects are multi-year. There are currently about 40 of them underway, and they really span the gamut from basic physical, chemical, biogeochemistry work all the way up through ecosystem modeling. And we work very close with our partners in South Florida. All of the federal agencies, the state agencies, they all have science efforts and components that we integrate with, as well as academia and even NGOs now who are really big into the science arena in South Florida. So it's really important that we do 2 things. Well, U.S.G.S. is, as sort of the science arm of the federal government, we're able to do some things that are more long-term looking and not maybe tied to current political issues or the political winds, and can take a little bit longer look and also do some very basic research on these things. But we also have to be doing things that are really relevant to the management and protection of the Everglades. So we try to go right down the middle of that road, providing high-quality science but still very management relevant. I'm just going to list a few of the topics. I'm not going to spend a great amount of time on any one of these, except probably Eden, which I'll talk about, and also some of our invasive species work. This is just a list of some of the project topic areas, some of which have been underway for several decades. The work in Florida Bay, for example, the monitoring of flows and into the Gulf of Mexico and Florida Bay. One I'd like to point out just in particular is this one right in the middle, Everglades Depth Estimation Network, Eden, and there's a website under there that you can access this tool. It's really was conceived by my predecessor back in the mid-1990s. If you're out in the Everglades doing research and you might be miles from the nearest water level gauge, but you really need to know, maybe you're a wading bird researcher and you need to know availability of prey, the small fish at certain times, and you really need to track water level at your site, this is a tool that because of the availability of this tool, you can do that. And the way they did it was first develop a detailed digital elevation model of almost the entire Everglades. And they did this back before technology really caught up to where it is now. They actually developed an airborne height finder system in a helicopter that would use GPS and a plumb bob. Every 400 meters across thousands of miles, the helicopter would hover, they'd drop the plumb bob down so it hit the ground, the GPS would be taking the location and the height of the helicopter. This took months and months and months. It was about $6 million worth of work to do that. Now there are better ways of doing that, but that still forms the basis of the model. And then we use the water gauge network, about 300 surface water gauges, to form a water surface elevation and bring those two together real time. So literally you can go on that website, put in locations, and find the real time, about a day lag at most, of what the conditions were at your study site. Really is a really great tool, and we continue to revise it. And for example, I'm sure you have no endangered species issues here that get in the way of ecosystem restoration, but in Florida we do. One of them is the Cape Sable seaside sparrow that lives in an area that requires mostly dry habitat. And of course what we've done through our impact is increase that habitat area so that sparrow has moved into areas that it normally wouldn't be, that normally before human impact would be a lot wetter. Well, now we're trying to do restoration where we increase water depths and hydroperiod. Now it conflicts with this endangered species, and there are only about 2,000 of them left. So it really is a critically endangered species. It's a constant issue, but what we do is provide a viewer on that website that's available to Fish and Wildlife Service and the Corps of Engineers, where they can track almost on a daily basis water levels, estimates in each of the 6 subpopulations of the sparrow in Everglades National Park. So again, we try to bring tools to real-time use for areas like this, and again, that's currently under litigation. The Fish and Wildlife Service is about to write another biological opinion on it. It's going to be an issue for quite a while. So again, wherever we can bring science to help inform those kind of issues, I think that's really important. This is just an image from the refuge where our mercury researchers are measuring atmospheric deposition of mercury into mesocosms, measuring flows near Florida Bay and Everglades National Park. We also, as I mentioned, do ecological modeling. paleoecology work. We work with a number of the performance measure species that are in our restoration plans, like crocodilians. And one that I just want to focus on a minute here, Burmese pythons, which has become a major problem in Everglades National Park. First introduced probably in about 2000 in a few isolated locations down near Flamingo, right at the tip of the park. Again, released, you know, somebody buys a cute little snake that's this big, and then next year all of a sudden it's this big, and then in 3 years it's 40 pounds, and they're done with it, and they go release it in the Everglades. Well, now we believe the population estimate in Everglades National Park is somewhere between 25,000 and 500,000 Burmese pythons just in Everglades National Park. That's a very wide population estimate if you're familiar with trying to. The reason that that population estimate is so wide is their detectability, we believe, is 0.5%. So if you're in a room, and we've done experiments, if you're in a room, a piece of the Everglades, it's the size of this room, but it's vegetated with, you know, water habitat and dense vegetation and a tree or two, and you release 3 radio-tagged or GPS-tagged Burmese pythons in this room and put 10 experienced, let's say 10 experienced people, you're unlikely to find them. Obviously, if you don't have access to the GPS information, but if you had to go find them in an area of the Everglades of this room, you're not going to find them. They're the most amazingly cryptic animals I've ever encountered, and I did encounter one, a 9-footer one time we had to dispatch. But what they've done was eliminate 90% of this medium and small mammal population in the entire park. And the way this, nobody even was thinking about this, and all of a sudden we began to notice in the drive, the 36-mile drive down in the Everglades from the entrance station down to Flamingo, we began to not see roadkill anymore, which was very unusual. Unfortunately, you'd see roadkill, rabbits, marsh rabbits, and possums, and occasional bobcat, and all of a sudden they'd started, and raccoons, they're gone. They're just completely gone. The pythons have wiped out that population. And one of the, so we're trying to help through science better increase the detection probability and also the capture probability, which I'm sad to say is probably pretty much of an uphill battle. They're ambush predators. They're very cryptic. And what we're worried about, too, that not many people are thinking about is the ecosystem state change that Everglades National Park is about to, or already underway, when you remove most of the mammals. And it's going to be an experiment we've unfortunately now initiated, and we'll have to track for the next 5 to 20 years. But I predict huge changes in vegetation and other animal populations just based on the impact of pythons, which grow to 18 feet, by the way. And you may have seen the recent news releases of the Nile crocodiles. There have been 3 that were, we knew they were there, we just didn't know where they were coming from or whether they were, what populations they came from, but there were 3 captured over the past several years, and pretty sure there's a greater population of Nile crocodiles, which is bad news because they happen to be fairly aggressive. Always bring good news from South Florida. That's not one of them. Picture of counting birds from an airboat down in, most everything we do is by airboat. And a lot of work with endangered species, again, using eDNA technology, both to find Burmese pythons and to find endangered species that are hard to detect. Paleoecology of Florida Bay, taking cores here to look at the past history of inflows to Florida Bay by using these very detailed cores that go down 4 meters. And again, most of our access to the Everglades, mostly because of permit conditions, or by helicopter. Most of Everglades National Park is a wilderness area, so it's very difficult to even get permits for park researchers to go in and do work. I'm not going to spend the time except on a few pretty pictures just to end with just a brief discussion about governance and how we organize restoration in South Florida. I don't know if you want to bring the lights back up, maybe near that mic. So we really are an interagency effort, just much like you have to be here and have been for a long time. And with the passage of the Water Resources Development Act in 2000 that authorized most of the restoration work we're on now, that was after the Kissimmee River clip mentioned, we formed a task force, an interagency task force. It's called the South Florida Ecosystem Restoration Task Force. You can find all this information on a nice website called evergladesrestoration.gov, which is where that video came from, evergladesrestoration.gov. This task force has some unique advantages, and somebody had the bright idea, fortunately, when it was formed, to include in the enabling legislation to make it exempt from FACA. And if you know what FACA is, that's the Federal Advisory Committees Act, which really, when it's in play, really hamstrings the ability to have public participation and other participation in meetings. And it's really frustrating, but it's there probably for a lot of other good reasons, but we're exempt from it. That means that we can have a decision-making meeting where the public can participate at a level of not just giving a 2-minute talk at a podium, but sitting down for 2 days with us in developing restoration alternatives. I'll come back to that in a minute. The task force is at the cabinet level, so it's the Secretary of Interior chairs it, and then there's numerous other entities at the federal and state level that are appointed to the task force, including Indian tribes in South Florida. Right below that, however, is where the work happens. It's called the Ecosystem Restoration Working Group, and it's a much larger body. It consists of federal, state, county, municipality, academia, tribes, and the private sector, representatives that come and meet, usually on a quarterly basis, and that's really where the working level stuff happens. And it really is an effective way of talking through the many conflicts and working relationships that we all have to maintain and keep going. Within that working group, for science, there's something called the science subgroup. And it is, again, all those working group member agencies and entities can appoint a scientist to the science subgroup, in which I happen to chair right now. And that science subgroup is really our interagency, and I shouldn't say agency because it includes many entities outside of agencies, but it's our mechanism and way of coordinating and communicating science. And again, you can find information and look at the membership we have on that evergladesrestoration.gov page. And that format has worked fairly well. I would say that our science coordination efforts are not always what they could be, because every entity usually has its own charge for science, their own budgets, and their own mandates that they have to take into play. So I would call us more of a science communication group, where we spend a lot of time communicating science, and we do try to coordinate and try to utilize each other's strengths. What we think would be a better model, but a more difficult one to implement given the history of restoration and how we're dealing with it, is one where there's true coordination, where you might have one agency that has a really strong contingent of hydrologists and physical modelers. I'm just making this up. And another agency that might be really good on ecosystem science and biology. And so instead of each one of those agencies trying to do the whole range of science, that you divide up tasks and responsibilities according to expertise. That would require pooling of budgets. And I'm sure you can imagine how spicy that can get in terms of, yeah, we'll put a pot of money in that everybody can share. We're still working on that. One of our largest science entities that sort of falls in the middle of this somewhere is the science arm of our restoration effort that's called RECOVER, Restoration, Coordination, and Verification. They come up with a nice acronym. The key to good effort is to have a good acronym. And that is the science entity that gets funding from the restoration dollars appropriated by Congress to track the progress of restoration and track performance measures so that we can report back and say whether or not restoration projects are working. Our lead entities on that effort are the Water Management District that Cliff mentioned earlier and the Corps of Engineers. Corps of Engineers is the implementing agency for some of these hydrologic change projects. The South Florida Water Management District is the sponsoring agency, and there's a 50-50 cost share. That's good because you get the state government and the federal government each chipping in. The challenge, though, is when one of those entities decides they don't want to do something. Let's just pick a science project, you name it. And if one decides that that's not going to happen, then the other is usually compelled to also not fund it because of the cost-sharing agreement that's in place. And that's been a little bit of a challenge. Again, I'm sure it doesn't happen here, but politics does get involved in this sometimes. And so that's created for science a little bit of a funding challenge from time to time when those things happen. I'm just going to end with one example of, I think, one of our biggest success stories in how this large interagency group works together. Because of frustrations we've all had with the length of time it's taken to implement some of the restoration projects that were envisioned starting back in 2000, we developed a smaller plan to do a piece of that restoration, but what's the best way to describe this? We included pieces of multiple projects into one overall project, but at a smaller scale. We called it CEP, the Central Everglades Planning Project. We worked with the Corps' process for planning a restoration project can take 8 years easily, just in the planning and design phases. And that was proving to be too long. And the original authorizing legislation, we had 70 of those projects, 70. And each one was going to be an 8-year planning horizon. And I don't mean all starting at once, very, arranged in series. And it was clear this was not going to be workable in the long run. So the Corps, with the help of some really forward-thinking folks, implemented a nationwide pilot project to condense the planning period down to 3 years. And we then developed this planning project on an accelerated time frame, interagency, where we integrated a number of those 70 different projects into one project that went through this accelerated time frame. And for 3 years, that's all everybody did in South Florida. And one of the really cool things, I think, one of the real positive lessons we learned, obviously whenever you're trying to do something like this and select a restoration alternative, there's multiple viewpoints and stakeholder perspectives on this. What we did was bring every one of those folks to the table, and we, over a year and a half, would have workshops that in some days were 4 days long, where they were planning workshops to work through restoration alternatives. We might, in a room like this, have 10 tables with, 8 chairs around it. And each one of those, you could self-assemble a group to develop your own pet project and restoration alternative, map it out in pencil on a map that was provided to you, have engineers and biologists and ecologists to consult with and ask questions about what was doable and what was not doable for whatever reasons. So it was like an expert assistance workshop where everyone, including private, citizens, could come in and be a part of it. And I will just say as an example, some of our biggest and most severe contentious issues are the endangered species issues, also recreation issues, conflicts of restoration, places in the Everglades that are now dry enough to hunt on that would become under a restoration scenario back to marsh and wetland. And actually a major component of that we've had to deal with is opposition from recreationists, hunters, who don't want the restoration to happen to mess up lands that they and their family have hunted on. That was just a real issue, and in fact, our state wildlife commission, the Florida Freshwater FWC, our Fish and Wildlife Commission at the state level, is an advocate for those interests, and so that was always a big contentious issue. But we brought everybody to the table and worked over a year and a half on various plans till we came up with one that satisfied everyone. And I really mean, to the best you can imagine, satisfied it. It wasn't perfect, nobody got everything they wanted, but they were truly involved in the process from the ground floor up. We'd have that workshop, these plans would be drawn, it would go back to the staff of the agencies who would do modeling, do analysis, look at all these different, and come back and report on it a month later at the next workshop and display all 10 plans and say, here's some of the highlights, here's the problems you would encounter, this is what that would cost. And then through that process, an iterative process, narrowed it down to a point where at the end, an alternative was selected and widely supported, and one that was nonpartisan in terms of the political. And that has now been, it's gone through the point to where it's been signed off by the chief, what's called a chief report at the Corps of Engineers, and it's now awaiting authorization in the next Water Resources Development Act. And just to give you scale, this is a scaled down project of the bigger one is about a $2 billion project, and it's going to have about a 25-year implementation phase. So we're still chugging along very, very slowly, but we're chugging along. So I just want to give that as one example of a real success story of bringing a lot of people together that otherwise we couldn't have done without that exemption to the FACA Act. All right, that's all I had. I wanted to see if there are questions. I noticed one hand was up. How do you do the questions? Are you going to take a microphone over?
Thank you. Well, I just have a quick question regarding what you just said about your sounding amazing way of pulling everybody together to, to plan for this. Who are the landowners of the area that you're working on?
Right. So it's a very wide group. One of the major landowners, a group of landowners, is certainly that Everglades agricultural area, because some of the projects where we need additional water storage might end up being on land that's purchased or has been purchased but would be adjacent to them. As you move downstream, you're into state and public lands, which makes it easy. But then as you get down to parts of the park that we want to restore hydrology on, that's going to affect potentially people on the peripheries that have developed into the fringes of what was historically Everglades. And so a lot of landowners, rock miners, the Indian tribes have 2 major reservations in that area, so it's a very wide group of people that have to take part in that. Came to the table, and I think just the fact that we changed that format from a meeting where there's a podium standing up and you have a group of people elevated up at some dais, listening, and oh, beep, the light goes off, your 2 minutes is up, and that's your public input. That just doesn't work. And this really, because what it did was bring people who had their ideas about what they wanted to happen, but at the same time, they now had to confront themselves some of the obstacles to what their pet projects were. And some of those are just based on physics and geography and money. Some of the greatest ideas would be wonderful if you had $100 billion. We don't have $100 billion. So they had to be able to confront that, and by bringing them into that process, which took a lot of work. I don't want to understate how much work that really was over of the whole 3-year period. About a year and a half of it was intense work with lots of meetings. But
yeah, I wondered, the title of this, I think, was something about adaptive management in the Everglades, and I wonder if there's an evident example where the monitoring and evaluation that's been done of projects has helped you, substantially change the management approaches you're using.
Yeah, answer is no. And I don't think I've seen that happen anywhere in the world yet. And I've been involved in adaptive management for quite a while. In fact, I first came here in the early 2000s to conduct an adaptive management workshop here. Actually, it was in Berkeley, but it was for the Bay Delta. And what I want to say is for us, the reason I say no is that we are moving at a slow enough pace that we really haven't yet implemented anything on a large enough scale using that to be able to test the concept. What it has allowed us to do, though, is to move forward this project that I just described. It's required to have an adaptive management component. There's a section in it dedicated to adaptive management, and it allowed us and gave people the comfort with moving forward with some uncertainty, because we'll never have 100% certainty. I think it allowed some risk-taking, because built into that is monitoring and science that allows us to monitor while we're doing. And the reason the premise of that in the Everglades is that we can no longer wait to get more and more certainty from a scientific standpoint, because the Everglades is still dying, and portions of it in a decade or 2 without some really quick intervention are going to be gone forever. So that concept of we think we know what to do, let's get that moving forward. But have we reached a point where we went down this pathway and had to shift gears because of what we've learned through adaptive management? I'm not aware of one yet. It's just going to take a while for that to work through. And if anyone knows of an example of that globally where that's happened yet, I'd like to hear about it, because I haven't been able to find one.
Thank you. I think a lot of this is sounding very familiar to those of us in the room. But I had a couple clarifying questions, focusing on kind of how you've organized science and management to deal with these issues. So you mentioned $6 million a year is coming through U.S.G.S. Are there other significant science funding sources as well? And if so, can you speak to general amounts?
And who develops the restoration plan you mentioned? Is it the task force? And who administers the restoration plan? And then one last thing, as you mentioned the pollution problem, but you didn't mention sources, and for those of us unfamiliar, can you clarify that?
Okay, thank you. Let me see if I start back at the first one. So funding levels, my program alone is $6 million. If you add up all the U.S.G.S. total dollars that are being spent on Everglades annually, it's probably closer to $10 million. During the heyday of the South Florida Water Management District, when I was research director there and I left in the late, essentially 1999, our research budget, annual research budget was $24 million, and there was 120 scientists in the agency. And that wasn't even counting the monitoring. They were in a whole separate group. That number is down quite a bit. The recover, the monitoring and assessment plan that's part of the core water management district effort is roughly $6 million a year. Fish and Wildlife Service, probably a smaller amount. The Park Service has something called the Critical Ecosystem Studies Initiative. That's about $4 million a year. So NOAA, there's some other entities that put money in, but probably to a lesser extent. I can give you one really graphic example of funding during the period of the decade where we had to go from from a narrative nutrient criterion for phosphorus to do the science to support the number that was demanded by a consent decree as part of a lawsuit that's still underway from 1988. That was $70 million of research in less than a decade just focused on that one issue. Okay, second question was who's in charge of all this? Or was that the third question? Second question was?
Yep, plan development and administration.
Yeah, so the overall, the planning of this last example that I used, this big interagency, the entity responsible for it on paper, the lead entity is the Corps of Engineers because of the way our restoration projects are put together, with the Water Management District being the sponsoring agency. So in the end, they're the ones that are going to do whatever we decide. But the broader task force really is the vehicle by which this direction was reached. The task force has no authority. The task force does not direct anybody to do anything, but the task force is comprised of cabinet-level folks from individual agencies that do direct and require and implement. So in the nirvana view of all this, each of them would go back and direct down for implementation of things that are consistent with the overall vision. And the third question was pollution. So the main sources of the nutrient pollution by far are the upstream agricultural sources in the Everglades agricultural area, mostly sugarcane, but in terms of concentrations per unit area, the vegetable and rice farming is the highest. Sugarcane is actually there's really not a lot of nutrient pollution comes off of it relative to other crops, but there's just such a huge surface area of it, and the Everglades is so incredibly sensitive to it.
Hi, I have a comment and then a question. First comment, we'll talk about adaptive management. I'm with the South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project, and we're doing it actively, and we can talk about that. But the question I had is you identified $2 billion needed over the next 25 years to just do the smaller scale restoration. Have you identified funding sources for that $2 billion, or how are you going to tackle that piece?
That's Congress. Congress is the funding source. So what happens, it's a two-step process. First, the project has to be authorized, and the vehicle to do that is the Water Resources Development Act. And then Congress has to, after that's been authorized, then they have to appropriate the money. And that, as you might imagine, that's been one of the challenges all the way along, in that a project that might take 25 years, every year, the federal government has to appropriate the money to the authorized project. So it's supposed to happen sequentially, and the state is supposed to match and march along that same route.
Nick, you mentioned a lot of obstacles to doing restoration. To what degree has the weight of scientific evidence been an obstacle? In other words, when do you know enough to do something?
Yeah, I would think that's very context dependent. I'll give two extreme examples, and again, I'm not representing the views of the U.S.G.S. here. I should probably say that at the beginning. I'm speaking just from my years of experience. But on the water quality issue, that was an issue that was in which in 1988 the federal government sued the state of Florida, a very unusual situation for allowing water quality degradation in the Everglades, violation of the Clean Water Act, and so on. So that lawsuit there's bitter fights for 4 years over that, and lots of money spent on lawyers. And then it was settled in 1992, and a consent decree was issued, and that's been the guiding thing ever since then on what's implemented to do that. As part of that consent decree, there's a very big scientific component, and it was specified as such in the actual wording of the consent decree. There was a technical oversight committee that was formed with specific charges, and the scientific sort of body was charged with coming up with what should the regulatory number be for total phosphorus to protect the Everglades. That was the one that took $70 million. So it took a monumental weight of science on that, because opposing sides would bring in and hire a lot of science. The sugar industry spent $12 million on a science program through Duke University to come in and work, bring in evidence on the other side. So that was one where everybody piled on for a good decade before it finally came to an end. On other the one that I'll give you as an example, maybe at the other end, is the importance of flow in the Everglades. We know that to get the Everglades back to where we want it to be and to prevent further degradation, not only do we have to bring the volume of water back and the water depths back, but we actually have to have moving, unimpeded flow of water for a number of reasons, maintaining this pattern landscape that we have. And that we have a lot more uncertainty associated with. But yet, there's been a lot of good work done. Actually, Laura Larson at Berkeley, she was with U.S.G.S. and she's now here at Berkeley, did some of the pioneering work on that. And so we're moving forward and potentially spending several $1 billion on an aspect that has a lot more uncertainty associated with it. But again, that's where the adaptive management and sort of lessons from other areas are coming in. While the microphone's going back there, I said a lot of times our focus of science and the amount of money and attention we spend a lot of times is driven by litigation.
Thank you for those perspectives. I have a question about how or to what extent you've addressed prioritizing science actions on that coordinating a task force without that coordinating component of one pool of money. How you went about that, what are some lessons learned, things that you would do again, things that you wouldn't, and then I guess we'll leave it there.
Yeah, I think the coordination of money and how we spend it for science is a real interesting one. I mean, right now we depend on, for lack of a better way of putting it, everyone's good graces to implement what we talk about. So if we have a science workshop on the new developments in flow-related science, and we decide that here are the gaps, here are the things that we need to know, and there's discussion about, well, we can do this part, we can do that part, and you're just really dependent on voluntary actions of the individual entities to go back and do that. And that's generally worked pretty well. Where, of course, where that doesn't work are the very contentious areas where there's a lot of opposing viewpoints, either among agencies or with some of the other stakeholders. And in my model, again, not the U.S.G.S. opinion here, this is just my model, I think what's going to be required at some point is to have a pool of funding. It doesn't have to be all the science, money has to be put in a pool, but there should be, on some issues, a common pool that's administered independently without, connection to outcomes to really be most effective in our application of science dollars. I'm convinced that any number of examples that I could pull up where we have not spent our science dollars as efficiently as we could. And we've also suffered from, again, because of changes in politics, you'll have a program going along and then all of a sudden it's just cut, completely and abruptly because of issues not related to science. And that's also very frustrating, especially when it's a long-term program that you've tried to piece together.
We have time for one last question.
To what extent, if any, has the project that you were working on benefited from NOAA's science programs and NOAA's coastal zone management program at the state level?
Yeah, I can't speak as much to the coastal zone management program, but certainly the area where currently there's a huge amount of interaction is on climate change issues along our reef track and looking at impacts on coral, and we depend very heavily on NOAA there. Also on NOAA, the fisheries work in the estuaries in Florida Bay, and again along the reef track, is tied in very closely. For example, one of our indicator species for a long time was pink shrimp, and all that work on pink shrimp is done by NOAA. I can't, like I said, the coastal zone part of it I can't speak to. And finally, I would say that we have a very large component of NOAA through our National Keys Marine Sanctuary program, where there's areas out off Key West and the Dry Tortugas that are, you know, marine protected areas now that are focuses of research and also protection at the same time. Thank you. Enjoyed it. You have my contact information. I'm sure Cliff has it. Please feel free to anytime contact me with questions. And if you get to South Florida, please look me up and we'll get you out in the Everglades.